Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the second episode of Milestones of Medina. Today's topic, we will be looking at the Battle of Badr, which is the first instance of armed conflict between the Muslims and the polytheists. We are joined today by Hira Javaid. For those of you who don't know, she's a third-year DPhil student in oncology. She completed her undergrad at Queen Mary University and completed a master's in cancer biology at UCL before coming to Oxford. She's also quite a famous juggler who was featured in a BBC interview, and she's known as the Oxford Juggler. She's also the current graduate event officer on the ISIC committee. So just a bit of extra background. Um, without further ado.
Thank you, Yusuf. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Um, so we'll be talking about the Battle of Badr today, which, as Yusuf mentioned, is one of the first armed conflicts that the Muslim army had to face after the emigration to Medina. And it's quite a miraculous battle, really quite interesting because the Muslims were heavily outnumbered and yet they came out victorious, and just the way the events unfolded and everything is really quite cool. And so Sheikh Yasser Qadi did like a very long and very detailed like talk on this. It was like 10 hours, and I've tried to watch most of it at two times the speed, and it's a lot of detail, but I've sort of like pulled out the main events and also some lessons that we can learn from it because as I mentioned in one of my last Sira talks, it's more about what lessons we can derive from the Sira and how we can use that to um, sort of apply these things into our daily lives now because details are good, but we need to think more about the application as well. So the background to this is what was happening was that trade caravans usually, they would go out of Mecca and then come back to Mecca after trading in Syria and other regions. And so there was this major caravan journey that used to happen annually. And they were coming back essentially from Syria with lots of goods and, lots of wealth, and it was really quite major. And so, what the Muslims decided was that when this caravan is sort of coming back to Mecca, they would, target it and essentially bring to Medina some of the goods and wealth. And Abu Sufyan was basically the chief, one of the chiefs of the Quraysh in Mecca. He was leading the caravan, and he used to send sort of spies out into the desert to see if he was being followed because he did sense that the Muslims would try to do this because earlier when he was making the journey from Mecca to Syria, he, this kind of skirmish was about to happen, but luckily he managed to escape, and they didn't, the Muslims couldn't get a hold of them because their paths sort of didn't cross. So he was aware that something like this might happen on the way back. And so he, like, when he was coming back and he realized that the Muslims are planning this targeting, he sent a fast rider back to Mecca and made it appear as if the caravan had already been attacked. And so in Mecca, the Quraysh got really, flustered, and because a lot of their investments were coming back, and so they would lose a lot of wealth. And so they decided to um, organize one of the biggest armies up until that point that Arabia had seen, because in Mecca, what used to happen was there were different tribes and they used to sort of fight each other, and the battles were, limited in number. And this was the first time where they thought, okay, let's everyone just come together, we'll go and protect our caravan. So they actually organized an army of 1,000 people, and the Muslims did not know, uh, much later that they were about to face an army, and they were only sort of 300, and they had set out of Medina just to basically, target the caravan. They thought, okay, that's, we'll outnumber them. The caravan has like 30, 40 guards. We'll be able to target it, and it will be nothing. So it's this unprepared army going out. They don't have much military strength. They don't have many weapons. They've just carried sort of their swords and uh, some bows and arrows and stuff, completely unprepared. And they go out. And so what happens sort of in the desert is that the different Bedouins, and there's like a desert communication network through these Bedouins that sort of just, travel everywhere, and they have their horses, and so the news spreads in the desert quite fast. And so um, the uh, the Muslims started receiving information that there might be this army that's coming from Mecca, and that they might actually be facing an army, but it was still very unclear. And so what the Prophet did, he took Abu Bakr, his best friend, with him, and actually set out himself to find information, and sort of go as a scout. And this was one of the few times, excuse me, this was one of the few times that the Prophet, instead of sending someone to collect information, he actually went uh, by himself, because it was such a sensitive sort of information, and he didn't want, if he was going to face an army, he wanted to be the first one to know that information. And so they went out into the desert, saw one of the Bedouins, and asked him, "Oh, have you heard about the Meccan army and Muhammad and his followers?" So obviously he hid the fact that he himself was Prophet Muhammad. And the Bedouin sort of, asked them, who are you? And started thinking, like, why should I tell these random people this kind of information? And the Prophet didn't want to lie, obviously, and so he said to the Bedouin, if you tell us the information, we will tell you where we are from. And so the Bedouin thought, okay, I can, give them the information, because it looks like they're not from either side, because then why would they tell me where they're from? And so the Bedouin said, I have information that Muhammad and his followers are camping at Badr, and they left Medina this many days ago, and they are at Badr right now. And I have information that the Meccan army they set out this many days ago, and they must be reaching Badr the next day. And so the Prophet was quite, surprised that it looks like they're going to face the army rather than the caravan. And so the Prophet thanked him for the information. And when the Bedouin asked, okay, so tell me, where are you from? The Prophet said, we are from water. And they basically turned on their horses and just galloped away. And the Bedouin was just left confused as to what is that. So it's an interesting thing that the Prophet didn't lie, but he said this sort of double meaning thing where, yes, we are from water, everything's created from water. And so it just left the Bedouin confused, and then came back. So now, obviously, he was quite worried, because they were going to be, there was going to be an army, and they weren't prepared. And he went back to his camp, and before sort of telling anyone what was about to happen, he was just praying and praying and praying. And meanwhile, while he was praying, the Muslims at Badr I came across two of the slaves from the Meccan army, which was about to reach Badr, and they started asking them, like, are you from the caravan, or are you from the army? Because obviously they didn't know at this point that there was an army. And the slaves started saying, oh, we are from an army, it's a really huge army. And the Muslims started sort of they couldn't believe their ears. And when the prophet came out and saw this, he confirmed that they were going to be coming across an army, and he wanted to judge the number of people in the army. And so he asked the slaves, how big is the army? And the slaves, obviously, they can't really count much, and so they were like, well, we don't know, we can't count. And so the prophet um, changed his question and asked, well, okay, how many camels do you slaughter for their food every day? Because that was the slave's job. And so the slaves said, well, about 9 or 10. And from that, the prophet figured out that the army was actually quite large, at about 900 to 1,000, because one camel would feed like 100 people. And so it just, these little details really show me how smartly the prophet, handled these things first, with the Bedouin, and then getting this information from the slaves, which the companions, couldn't uh, gather, just by really tailoring the type of questions that he asks. Um, so yeah, so when the Muslims heard at this point that they were going to meet an army, obviously they were very disheartened, and they were really worried, and rightfully so. Um, but the prophet had actually received good news from God, and um, God has promised the prophet that whether he meets the caravan or he meets the army, he will be victorious. And so the prophet tried to convey that to the Muslims, and sort of um, reassured them. And eventually, some of the leaders, or sort of leading figures in the Muslim army, they came out and openly declared their support, and said, yes, we're coming with you. And they said, oh, messenger of God, do as God has commanded you to do. We are right behind you. We're not going to say to you, like the children of Israel said to Moses, that you and your God go and fight. We are sitting right here. But we will say, you and your Lord go fight. We are right behind you. And so this was someone from the Muhajirun, the immigrants, and then people from the Ansar, who were originally in Medina. They also said, yes, we're Muslims too. We gave you the promise of protection, and we are going to come and we'll fight with you. And so when the prophet heard this, he was quite delighted that, okay, they've got the spirit, they're ready to fight. And so then they started coming up with the strategy. And what the prophet did was he sort of distributed the Muslim army into three different groups. And well, some people say that there was a fourth backup group for reinforcement, sort of in the back. And they also placed themselves very strategically. So one of the companions actually came to the prophet and said, the fact that we are camped in this particular position at Badr, is this your decision, or is this something God has told you to do? And the prophet said, this is, just my decision to camp here. And so the companion said, okay, then in that case, I suggest that we move a few meters ahead, so that the water wells are behind us. And so if the wells were behind them and this was a Muslim army and the Meccan army was on the other side, they wouldn't be able to get hold of the water, and the Muslims would have all the water. And the prophet agreed that that was a good suggestion. So they moved the army a little bit to the front. And in terms of the actual arrangement of the army, this was also really quite interesting, because what the prophet did was he told them to literally stand in rows, shoulder to shoulder, basically how we stand in prayer. And it was like they were walled, like a very strong wall. And this is even mentioned in the Quran as like bunyan marsus, like really firm walled kind of structures. And they were in rows, and each row was literally very solid. And this is um, quite interesting, because previous to this, the Arabs didn't really arrange their armies like this, and it is actually a very modern way of organizing armies. And even now, this is a very solid arrangement, and infantries are sort of taught to march together like this, shoulder to shoulder, so that they're like very solid. So it's, quite an interesting thing that the prophet was receiving all this knowledge from God. Obviously, he didn't go to military school and, have this kind of uh, training or whatever, but he was receiving this knowledge. And so he would go behind in the rows and literally like tell people to straighten the rows, just like, he would for prayer. And this was a really interesting little event that what he there was one of the companions who was slightly out of his row, and so the prophet went and he sort of like poked him, and was like, get back into your row, you're breaking the row. And the companion said, why did you poke me? What did you poke me for? I demand justice because you caused me pain for no reason. And it's interesting that, they're about to fight a battle, and this companion is saying this, but the prophet didn't get angry or anything, and said, oh yeah, yeah, actually you have a point. Okay, why don't you poke me instead? Like, it's just a little poke, but the prophet doesn't even let that one, he doesn't even overlook that. And so he raised his shirt for the companion to poke him, and then the companion instead bowed down and kissed him on his abdomen, and the hugged him. And so the prophet said, well, what is that? And the companion said, if I am going to fight in this battle, and if I'm going to die, I want this to be my last action. And so it's just, yeah, I just thought it was a nice little detail to mention. So, yeah, so this is sort of the Meccan army then coming from the other side, and they were ready to fight. So throughout the Battle of Badr, we see instances where God helped the Muslims, and basically aided them immensely. And without his help, there was no way that the Muslims would have become victorious, because they were heavily outnumbered, and it was just not the right ratio for victory. So one of the things that God did was he actually sent them rain. So it said that it was a very nice, gentle rain, and so they could sort of cleanse themselves and they could refresh. And also, this is referred to in the Quran as well. And it says, when he caused you to sleep as a reassurance from him, and sent down water from the sky to cleanse you, so that he might purify you with it, and remove from you the fear of Satan, and to strengthen your heart, and to make your feet firm thereby. So it's one thing, it's rain, but it's so, because it's God's plan, or plans are so well thought out. This single thing, this rain, had so many good impacts, so many different things that it did. So cleansed them, purified them. There was this physical cleansing, it was like a bath, and they felt energized. But also there was this spiritual cleansing, and they, it removed the sort of anxieties and worries that they had, and then it strengthened their heart. And then another impact of the rain was that, if you've ever been to the desert, and you try to walk in the sand, you realize that it's actually really, really hard to walk on extremely dry sand. And so the right amount of rain actually makes it quite solid and sort of like concrete, so that they can march properly, and they would have, their feet would be firm with it. And if it was too much rain, obviously it would be too muddy. So this is what some people say, that on the Quraysh side, on the Meccan side of the army, there was actually really heavy rain, and so it made it really muddy and difficult for them. Whereas on the Muslim side, it actually helped them to move further. So it was really quite a blessing of God. This happened on the night of Badr, before the battle. And then he also caused them to sleep, And this is also quite interesting because if you've got something major coming the next day, it's very hard to sleep. And, even if it's like an exam or something, but these people had a battle and God caused them to sleep, so deeply so that they would wake up refreshed and strong the next morning. And meanwhile, so one of the companions was saying that literally everyone fell asleep that night, but the prophet just kept praying and praying and praying the whole night. And it's said that he also dozed off a little bit, and this is when God sent his other miracle and his other sort of reassurance to the prophet, which was that he showed him a dream where he basically showed the army as, not very many people. And so God refers to this as well in the Quran. When God showed them to you in your dream as few, and if he had shown them as many, you would have lost courage and disputed in the matter, but God saved you, and God is fully aware of what lies in the heart. So through this dream, God reassured the prophet and he comforted the prophet. And this was just one of the many things that kept happening throughout Badr, where God was sending his help. And right on the day of Badr, the prophet was still praying, up to the very last moment of battle, even though he knew that God had promised him victory. He still kept praying, praying up until the last moment. And one of the things that happened was that he basically was praying in a state of desperation, and he had his like arms lifted up to the sky. And normally he would pray like this at sort of like shoulder level, but this time he was literally begging. And he was so involved in the prayer that his cloak fell from his shoulders and he didn't even notice. And then Abu Bakr, his companion, came and put his cloak on him and sort of hugged him from the back and said, "You will get what your God promised you. You will get what your God promised you." And so Abu Bakr was sort of like this exemplifying of this hope. And the prophet was fearful, not in terms of the army, but he was fearful that his prayer might not be accepted. And so there was these two characters exemplifying fear and hope, which is really important. Um, Characteristics of a believer to kind of carry these side by side. And so at this point, he received another revelation, and this time God revealed to him that there were going to be 1,000 angels coming, ranks upon ranks to help the believers. And so the prophet was just delighted by this news. And then they charged into the battle. And we all know what happens next. The Meccans, they came out with a lot of casualties. Most of their, you know, like really big names and big chiefs were actually killed in this battle. And 15% of their army was killed, whereas only about 13, 14 on the Muslim side were killed. So that was like less than 5%. And it's yeah, oh, okay, I'll mention that later. So the lessons from this, one, the importance of prayer, in that even though he is the prophet of God, even though God promised him victory, he was still, reinforcing all of these actions with prayer, just continuously praying, whether it was the night of Badr, the day of Badr, even throughout the battle, he would sort of retreat to the camp, pray, and then come back out. And, he just kept doing this constantly. Um, and yeah, one of the companions actually said, "I never saw anyone pleading God like the prophet did on the night of Badr." So it just goes on to show how important it is. Like, even if you're so sure about something that you're going to get it and you almost think, "Oh, I don't really need to pray for this. It's so sure." But, even then, prayer is basically, it's what carries the decree and the event. Another lesson is that it is okay to sometimes sort of feel a bit hesitant and a bit nervous, if there's if you're going to be doing something major, it doesn't mean that you're low on iman or something like that. It's just a very natural human thing to do. And so this was when, for example, the prophet told the believers that they were going to meet the army. A lot of them were very hesitant, and they were like, we can't really fight an army, we're not prepared, all of that stuff. And so the in the Quran it's mentioned, when your Lord brought you out of your home in truth, while indeed a party among the believers were unwilling. And the important thing to note is that the word that was used for the believers was mu'minun, which is a much higher state than just being a Muslim. To actually be a mu'min, like a true believer. And so God still called them mu'minun, even when they were in this sort of state of hesitation and nervousness, because eventually they managed to regain their courage and put their trust in God. So it's okay to have sort of like these dips, and that's one of the lessons that we can derive from this. It doesn't make us bad, or it doesn't mean that we have low iman at these points. The other lesson is that God wants to see us put in the effort. So, for example, he could have sent, Jibril, the angel Gabriel, to just, you know, um, instantly cause the entire Meccan army to be defeated and destroyed. And, God didn't really need the Muslims to fight, because God is all powerful. He could have just defeated the Meccans without any of this thing actually happening. But the sort of lesson from this is that we still need to put in the effort, even if we have God's help. And so that's why God sent these individual angels. He sent 1,000, and the way these angels were working was that they weren't fighting for the Muslims, they were helping the Muslims. And so the Muslim himself had to, raise a sword or the whip or throw the arrow. But what the angels were doing was then completing their action, sort of. So it's such an important lesson here that we still have to take the steps if we want to see something being fulfilled. It's our responsibility. We can't just sit back and pray. We have to literally take the actions, and then God's help comes and helps us while we're taking these actions, and He helps us to complete those actions and get the results that we want. And throughout the battle, the just miraculous things were happening where, one of the Muslim fighters, for example, they would raise a whip or something and hear a sound, whereas the whip hasn't come down yet, but the enemy in front of him is just gone. And, that was basically the angel. And same thing with, sword. He would just raise the sword, and, the angel would then help it to reach its target, and help the Muslim fighter to kill one of the Qurayshi men. And it was this also really interesting and kind of funny event where one of the companions went back to the Prophet and said, "Oh, I don't have a sword anymore. How do I fight?" And the Prophet actually gave him twigs. And instead of saying like, what am I supposed to do with these twigs? He had this belief and he had this trust, and he was like, "Okay, I'll obey the Prophet." He went back, and he, as soon as he raised the twig, it became a sword. And they say that he fought with that sword in so many battles afterwards. And this was another one of those miracles, and people kept seeing this happen. And so it's a very interesting battle where you have this unseen angels and miracles happening and merging with the human side of things and the Muslims, and this whole event happening together and merging. And it's really cool to think about it like that. Another lesson here, obviously, one of the biggest lessons is that with God's help, even the most improbable and just unbelievable things can happen. And obviously, if you see the numbers, the Muslim army just so outnumbered, and the Meccan army, they had the best weapons, the best armor, the strongest camels and horses, and strong fighters. and they came prepared for battle, but what the Muslim army had was obviously God's help, and so it is no surprise that they came out victorious. And another lesson is that God's decree shall come to pass, in that the way the events unfolded, the prophet didn't plan to go and have a fight. Neither did the Meccan army go out knowing that there was going to be a battle. There was still a lot of confusion. When they realized, okay, the caravan is now safe, we can go back to Mecca. But then some people like Abu Jahl insisted that they go and they fight, and you know even with the Muslims, they could have gone back to Medina, but then they decided to fight as well. So it was God orchestrating this whole thing, because he wanted the Muslims to come out victorious. He wanted to show that the Muslims are a force of power in this land now. And even if these two armies tried to plan to meet, even then it might not have happened. Like the initial skirmish that I talked about, where they couldn't cross paths, and so Abu Sufyan's caravan escaped safely. But here, because God wanted to establish this truth, he made it happen, and so that should increase our trust in God's plans and God's decree. Um, Oh, I'm so sorry, Yusuf. This is the end, and I was supposed to engage everyone in the middle, and then I just kept talking and talking and talking. I'm so sorry. So I guess the last slide is some of the qualities of the Prophet that we can take from here. One being tawakkul, which is trust on God, and how much him and the believers had to put their trust in God that they would come out victorious, even though it seemed like such an impossible thing. Same thing with the optimism and just the courage that they displayed throughout. And then mercy even in the time of war, because we have stories of how once they were victorious and they captured a whole lot of prisoners of war, they still treated the prisoners of war with so much kindness, and the Prophet instructed the Muslims to actually take care of them properly, and so they would actually give them better meals sometimes than they were themselves eating. So it was a lot of lessons that we learned from this whole. And I think overall it's just one of those miracles where if you stop to think and you're like, if those 313 Muslims had been wiped out, that would have been the end, basically. They were small, and that's what the Prophet was really concerned about as well. And he was praying to God that if we are defeated today, then there will be no one to worship you with tawheed and you're properly, because this would be the end. So it was really such a critical battle, and yeah, they came out victorious, alhamdulillah. So